Imagine a corporation so powerful, it had its own army, its own navy, and the legal right to declare war on foreign nations. Not a country, not a king, a business. In 1602, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, received a charter that no corporation before or since has ever matched. And over the next 2 centuries, this single company would control 20% of the world's trade and accumulate wealth worth an estimated $7.9 trillion in today's money. More than Apple, Amazon, Google, and Microsoft combined. This is the dark history of a corporation that became an empire. And today, we're going to trace its rise, its reign of terror, and the rot that brought it crashing down. Chapter 1. The Signature. In 1602, something extraordinary happened in a chamber in The Hague. A group of merchants, not kings, not generals, merchants, sat around a table and signed a document that would reshape the world, the Charter of the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the United East India Company. What made this document different from every trading company that came before it? 3 words: sovereign corporate power. The Dutch government didn't just grant the VOC a license to trade, they granted it the power to negotiate treaties, build fortresses, maintain standing armies, and administer justice, including the death penalty. And perhaps most remarkably, they granted it the power to wage war. Let that sink in. A group of businessmen, motivated entirely by profit, were handed the legal machinery of a nation-state. The merchants who signed that charter weren't thinking about conquest. They were thinking about pepper, nutmeg, and cloves, spices worth more than gold per ounce. But when you hand private citizens the tools of empire, empire is exactly what you get. The VOC was organized into 6 regional chambers across the Netherlands, governed by a board of 17 directors, the Heren 17. 17 men who answered to no parliament, no monarch, no public, just shareholders. And this is where it gets eerily modern. Because the VOC didn't just pioneer corporate imperialism, it pioneered the stock market itself. Shares of the VOC were traded on the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, the world's first. Ordinary Dutch citizens could buy a piece of this machine. Butchers, bakers, servants, they all invested. The VOC invented the publicly traded corporation. And with it, something we still live with today, the separation of ownership from consequences. Chapter 2. A license to wage war. Most corporations today have a legal department. The VOC had a war department. Within a decade of its founding, the company maintained a private navy of over 40 warships and a standing army of 30,000 soldiers, larger than most European kingdoms. These weren't ceremonial forces. The VOC fleet engaged in full-scale naval warfare against the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the English. They laid siege to fortified cities. They captured entire island chains. In 1605, the VOC seized the fortress of Ambon from the Portuguese, their first major military conquest. It was a statement. This was no longer a trading company. It was a colonial power that happened to sell spices. The company built its headquarters in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, from scratch, governing a network of trading posts and forts from South Africa to Japan. Their philosophy was simple: trade where possible, force where necessary. When the Sultan of Ternate resisted VOC demands for exclusive clove trading rights, the company didn't negotiate. They burned his clove trees to the ground and replanted them under VOC control. When local rulers in Ceylon refused to comply, the VOC simply replaced them with more cooperative ones. They were writing the playbook that every colonial power would follow for the next 3 centuries. But something far darker was coming. Something that would reveal the true cost of giving a profit-seeking corporation the powers of a state. Chapter 3: The Spice Wars. Nutmeg. It seems absurd now. A spice you sprinkle on eggnog nearly caused the extinction of an entire people. But in the 17th century, nutmeg was among the most valuable substances on Earth. And there was only one place it grew, the Banda Islands, a tiny volcanic archipelago in what is now eastern Indonesia. 10 small islands, maybe 15,000 inhabitants, and the entire world's supply of nutmeg. The VOC wanted a monopoly. The Bandanese wanted to trade freely with the English, the Portuguese, anyone who offered a fair price. For years, the company tried contracts, threats, and blockades. The Bandanese resisted. In 1621, Governor General Jean Pietazun Cohen decided to solve the problem permanently. What followed was one of the most devastating corporate actions in human history. Cohen dispatched a force of soldiers and Japanese mercenaries to the Banda Islands. The campaign was systematic. Villages were burned. Leaders were executed. The population, estimated at 15,000 people, was reduced to roughly 1,000 within months. Those who survived were enslaved on nutmeg plantations run by Dutch colonists called perkeniers. The VOC had achieved its monopoly. The price was genocide. And Jan Pietazun Cohen? He was celebrated in Amsterdam as a hero of commerce. Streets were named after him. He had delivered the monopoly, and the shareholders were pleased. The pattern repeated across the archipelago. The VOC controlled clove production by destroying any trees that grew outside their designated plantations. They called these campaigns hongi raids, armed expeditions to uproot unauthorized spice trees and punish anyone who dared grow them. Entire ecosystems were altered. Entire communities were shattered. Chapter 4: Empire of Exploitation. The spice monopoly was just the visible peak. Beneath it lay a vast machinery of forced labor that powered the company's profits. Across its territories, from the Cape Colony in South Africa to the plantations of Java, the VOC relied systematically on enslaved people. At the Cape Colony, the company imported enslaved workers from across the Indian Ocean. They built the colony's infrastructure, worked its farms, and served in its households. Enslaved people outnumbered free European settlers for most of the VOC's tenure there. In Batavia, the colonial capital, the story was the same. The city ran on forced labor. The VOC maintained detailed records of its human property, inventories listing people alongside bales of pepper and crates of porcelain. It wasn't incidental to the business model. It was the business model. The company's profit margins depended on minimizing labor costs to zero. When enslaved workers died from disease, overwork, and brutal conditions, they were simply replaced. The VOC also perfected forced cultivation. In Java, local populations were compelled to grow coffee, sugar, and indigo and sell exclusively to the company at prices it set. If harvests fell short, entire communities faced punishment. This system would persist in various forms until the 20th century. Here is the uncomfortable arithmetic of the VOC. Every dividend paid to shareholders in Amsterdam, every canal house built along the Herengracht, every painting commissioned during the Dutch Golden Age, all of it was subsidized by the labor of people who had no choice, no voice, and no share in the wealth they created. Chapter 5: Amsterdam's Dark Golden Age. Walk along the canals of Amsterdam today and you're walking through the VOC's balance sheet. The grand houses of the Herengracht, the Keizersgracht, the Prinsengracht, built with spice money. Rembrandt, Vermeer, Frans Hals. The entire Dutch Golden Age was fertilized by the profits of monopoly and exploitation. Amsterdam in the 17th century was the richest city in the world, and the VOC was the engine. The company's warehouses along the waterfront were the Amazon fulfillment centers of their era. Pepper from Malabar, cinnamon from Ceylon, silk from China, porcelain, tea, coffee, textiles. The volume was staggering. And then there was the financial innovation. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, established in 1611 to trade VOC shares, became the template for every stock market that followed. The VOC invented concepts we take for granted: publicly traded shares, dividends, futures contracts, even short selling. Financial instruments that wouldn't become common elsewhere for 2 centuries. But here's what made it truly revolutionary and truly dangerous. For the first time in history, ordinary citizens could profit from colonial exploitation without ever seeing it. A widow in Amsterdam could collect her VOC dividend and never know about the burned villages, the enslaved workers, the destroyed communities that generated her returns. The stock market created distance between profit and its human cost. That distance still exists today. Every index fund, every quarterly earnings report, every shareholder meeting that focuses exclusively on returns. The architecture was built here, in Amsterdam, 400 years ago. Chapter 6: The Rot Within. By the mid-1700s, the VOC was the largest commercial enterprise the world had ever seen. It was also dying. And the disease was one that no navy could fight: corruption. The very structure that made the VOC powerful, its decentralization, its vast distances from oversight, also made it a paradise for embezzlement. VOC officials in the East Indies lived like kings, building personal fortunes through private trade. Technically forbidden, but universally practiced. Governors skimmed profits. Captains sold cargo off the books. Warehouse managers falsified inventories. The corruption wasn't a bug. It was a feature of a system where men with absolute local power operated months of sailing time from any accountability. Back in Amsterdam, the Heren 17, the 17 directors, had their own problems. The company's books were a masterpiece of creative accounting. Dividends were paid not from actual profits, but from borrowed money. The VOC was, in many ways, running a Ponzi scheme, paying old investors with new debt while maintaining the illusion of profitability. When auditors finally examined the company's finances, they found debts hidden for decades, assets that existed only on paper, and revenue projections based on nothing but optimism. Sound familiar? Competition from the British East India Company eroded market share. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War devastated shipping. But the real killer was internal. The company was spending more on its military and corrupt officials than it earned from trade. An empire too expensive to maintain and too dishonest to reform. Chapter 7: The Fall. On the 31st of December, 1799, the charter of the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie expired. It was not renewed. The most powerful corporation in human history simply ceased to exist. Its debts were assumed by the Dutch state. Its territories became direct colonies. The VOC died not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic transfer of paperwork. The VOC died not with a bang, but with a bureaucratic transfer of paperwork. 2 centuries of trade, conquest, exploitation, and innovation, reduced to a line item in a government ledger. But the VOC didn't really disappear. Its legacy is embedded in the operating system of the modern world. The stock market. The multinational corporation. The principle that a business entity can operate with the power and impunity of a state. The idea that shareholders can profit from actions they never see and never sanction. When a modern corporation pollutes a river in a country whose regulators it has captured, that's a VOC story. When a tech company wields more influence over information than a government, VOC story. When executives cook the books while paying dividends from debt, VOC story. The VOC proves something we keep relearning. Concentrating too much power in any single entity, whether it wears a crown or trades on an exchange, produces the same result. Exploitation of the powerless, corruption of the powerful, and collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. 4 centuries later, the question the VOC left behind still doesn't have an answer. How do you give an organization enough power to operate in the world without giving it so much power that it devours the world? We built the modern economy on the VOC's blueprint. Maybe it's time we examined what else we inherited.